On an overcast Friday in October 2011, Brett Thornton parked her 1999 Chevrolet Silverado beside the white gravel curb in front of Harlan Feed and Seed in Vigo County, Indiana, shut the engine off on the second try, and tugged the nylon strap that held the tailgate tight against a bent latch. The truck had 287,000 miles on the odometer, rust climbing both rocker panels, and a driver's seat split wide enough to show yellow foam. Her overalls were faded and clean, with 2 hand-sewn patches on the left knee, and her boots carried dry mud from a hog lot she had checked before dawn. People saw the truck first, then the clothes, then the handwritten tab she signed at the counter every week, and they made their judgment in that order. Inside, the seed rack smelled like lime and molasses feed. Brett read the posted prices, asked for 2 tons of grower mix and mineral, and nodded while the clerk wrote the total on a ruled index card under her name. $1,386 that week. She did what she always did. She said thank you, loaded the pallets, and told the clerk she would settle before sunset. She always did. Nolan Pike walked in 5 minutes later with dealership confidence that arrived before his boots did. Clean shirt pressed hard at the seams, polished pickup with dealer tags outside, and a branded cap that looked fresh off a shelf. Nolan had a way of speaking like a man presenting weather forecasts nobody else had access to. He watched Brett sign her tab and said, loud enough for 3 customers to hear, that she was the woman farming 1987 in 2011. Then he opened a brochure and offered a 12-year equipment note at 6.9%, framing it as common sense, modern scale, oxygen for survival. Brett looked at the page once, folded it back toward him, and said 4 words. I pay as I go. That line sounded small in the store. The arithmetic behind it did not. Brett's rule about debt did not come from a slogan, and it did not come from fear of change. It came from memory, then repetition, then proof. In March 1985, when she was 20 years old and still working nights at a grain elevator, she stood on the edge of a muddy sale ring and watched her father's machinery auctioned in lot numbers that erased a lifetime in 90 minutes. The family had expanded hard in 1979 and 1980 when rates looked manageable, then saw variable debt climb as operating margins shrank. By the winter of 1984, they were paying interest first and fees second, and by spring the lender moved. No cruelty, no shouting, just paperwork and numbered stickers on steel. She remembered the auctioneer's speed, the way the crowd leaned in for bargains, and the way her father kept his hands in his pockets so nobody could see them shake. The 1974 planter, sold for less than 1 season of parts, had cost. The combine brought half what the note balance had been. Her father went home in silence and sold the last 40 acres that autumn to close the remaining deficiency. He did not say debt was evil. He said one sentence at the kitchen table that stayed with Brett for decades. Interest does not care if it rains. From 1986 through 1998, Brett built her own operation on a slower clock than almost everyone around her. She rented first. 80 acres at $72 per acre in 1986, then 120 acres in 1989 at $81 per acre, then 180 acres by 1993. She saved from grain hauling, custom baling, and winter repair works. Her annual gross income in the early years moved between $46,000 and $74,000, depending on weather and markets. But her personal draw stayed narrow. Rent on a small house, used work clothes, bulk groceries. No card balances, no financed vacations, no restaurant debt disguised as convenience. When she bought her first owned parcel in 1999, 130 acres at $1,150 per acre, for a total of $149,500. She did it with $92,000 in cash and a 5-year seller note for $57,500 at 4.5% fixed, then cleared it in 42 months. That payoff was the hinge point. She kept a ruled ledger in a metal drawer, and every line tracked one question. Did this decision increase resilience or increase obligation? She was not allergic to all borrowing in theory. She was against fragile borrowing in practice. If an expense could not survive one bad season, she treated it as a warning. By 2004, she had expanded to 410 owned acres and 190 rented acres, raising hogs and rotating corn, soybeans, and winter wheat on mixed ground. She was not large by regional standards, and she knew that. What she had was cash rhythm, feed on tab Monday through Friday, full payment Friday before sunset, repairs funded from reserve, not from revolving plastic, insurance current, property taxes current, input size to likely yield, not optimistic yield. Her ledger from 2005 to 2010 showed why the routine looked plain from the road but strong on paper. In 2005, gross farm revenue was $612,400, operating expense $468,900, net before tax $143,500, with $58,000 moved to reserve. In 2006, gross $587,200, expense $452,300, net $134,900, reserve transfer $52,000. In 2007, drought pressure pushed net down to $96,700. She cut discretionary equipment spending to $3,140 and still added $21,000 to cash. In 2008, when many producers took dealer incentives tied to long notes, she bought a used grain drill for $400, spent $280 on bearings, and skipped a $31,000 finance package. In 2009, net rose to $151,200. She bought no new pickup, no utility vehicle, no lifestyle upgrades. In 2010, she crossed a liquid reserve threshold of $310,000 and wrote in the margin, "Bad years are coming. Keep powder dry." People saw the old truck and believed they saw the whole story. They did not see the reserve account, the short pay cycles, the way she priced risk weekly instead of seasonally. What she did not know yet was that one policy change at the feed store in 2014 would test this entire philosophy in public and in private. Discipline for Brett was rarely dramatic. It looked like maintenance logs and ordinary Fridays. In 2011, she was offered 2 dealership bundles that would have modernized her line overnight. Package 1 was a finance tractor and mixer combination at $94,000 plus tax, 6.9% over 12 years. Monthly payment $932 before insurance riders. Package 2 added an input credit line and service contract, taking total committed payments above $1,700 per month in low-margin quarters. Nolan called those numbers manageable and pointed to projected efficiency gains. Brett ran her own comparison on the back of a seed invoice. Option A, finance, $94,000 principal. Approximate total paid over 12 years near $134,208, not including late-season carrying costs on inputs. Option B, cash and repair. Buy a used 1978 International Harvester, 108.6 for $8,400 when one appeared clean at regional auction, then reserve up to $2,500 annually for maintenance. Even with a major pump rebuild and tires in year one, projected 5-year costs stayed below $21,000. The gap exceeded $100,000 to $13,000 before considering risk. She waited, and when margins tightened in the years after 2014, the auction gave her exactly what she expected. The 1086 came through with straight sheet metal, solid rear rubber and hour meter, reading 9,870. She paid $8,400 cash, trailered it home, and spent 2 weekends replacing worn seals and wiring. Later, when fuel delivery got irregular and part prices rose, the injection pump began to lag under load. She had it rebuilt for $1,120 by a specialist in Clay County, then logged fuel burn for 6 weeks to confirm the fix. No showroom shine, no payment book, no lender phone calls. Work done, bill paid. Her home budget stayed equally plain. Annual household spending settled near $31,740. Food, $6,480. Clothing, $540. Utilities, $2,220. Property upkeep, $3,900. Vehicle fuel and insurance, $4,860. Health and farm-related out-of-pocket costs, $5,700, each $40. Local giving and church support, $2,000. Miscellaneous and contingency, $6,000, with no revolving balance carried at any point. She did not starve the operation. She starved leakage. By the second week of March 2014, she had already paid 10 straight Friday tabs in full that year, each one signed in blue ink, each one cleared before sunset, each one treated as promise rather than habit. Around her, many good farmers were making different choices for reasons that made sense at the time. Scale pressure, dealer incentives, lender optimism, family needs, weather bets. Brett did not lecture them. She kept loading feed, kept paying weekly, and kept her ledger balanced to the dollar, while the town continued reading patched knees and rust as evidence of struggle instead of strategy. Then April arrived with 2 notices taped to the feed store door, one about ownership transfer and one about account policy, and Brett read both before she touched the handle. The first notice was plain. Harlan Feed and Seed had been sold after Walter Harlan's stroke in late March. The second notice was written in polished corporate language that did not hide the number at the center of it. All handwritten tabs would end May 1st, replaced by a branded revolving account at 19.24% annual interest unless customers enrolled in automatic draft through a partner bank. She stood there in the same faded overalls, the same 2 hand-sewn patches on her left knee, the same mud-marked boots, and held the paper steady with a callous thumb while a gust pushed rain along the curb. Her Silverado sat 20 feet away with rust climbing higher around the rear wheel wells, tailgate still cinched by nylon strap, and one brake light out again. The visual told one story. The policy told another. Inside, 3 customers were already discussing reward points and deferred payment windows like it was a holiday offer. Nolan Pike reached the counter just as she did. Dealership logo bright on his jacket. Clean truck idling outside with chrome still reflecting the overcast sky. He tapped the notice with one finger and smiled in a way that suggested inevitability rather than argument. "Now everybody is finally modernized," he said. "No more pencil tabs and Friday rituals. You can roll feed, inputs, and equipment into one real structure." He slid a folder toward her before the new manager could speak. The first page listed a mixer wagon, upgraded tractor lease, and bundled operating line. Total package commitment, $186,400 with variable terms after promotional periods. The sheet used the word flexibility 6 times. It used the word risk 0 times. Brett handed the folder back without opening page 2. I do not revolve feed. Nolan looked at her truck through the glass, then back at her patched knee, and made the judgment everyone in that room had heard before, only sharper because policy gave him cover. 1 bad season, and you are done. At the register, she paid that week's balance in full, $1,472.60, counted in exact denominations, and asked the manager to print the receipt on company letterhead. Not defensive. Documentary. If rules were changing, she would keep records. The manager, Kelsey Ward, had come in from Terre Haute Retail and knew software better than hog weights. She was not unkind, only procedural. She explained that by May, feed could be purchased only by direct debit, cash at time of sale, or branded revolving line. Brett asked one question. If I pre-fund an account weekly, can I draw against my own balance? Kelsey paused, checked the policy binder, and said no. Corporate wanted standardized payment channels. Brett nodded once, took the receipt, and walked back to the truck while Nolan remained at the counter discussing bundled financing with 2 younger operators who were trying to expand acreage before rent moved again. What happened next looked stubborn from the outside and measured from the ledger. The same week, policy changed. A late freeze hit low ground, and then a wet planting window stretched long enough to cut her projected corn stand by 14%. Hogs still needed feed targets met. The shortfall pushed her weekly feed cost up by $1,860 for 12 straight weeks, a cumulative increase of $22,320 over her normal spring run rate. Most producers bridged that kind of hit with revolving credit and hoped to catch up at harvest. Brett built a harder cash loop instead. The deeper operating structure was reinforced after 1985, in the period when Walter Harlan still worked the old desk in a flannel shirt, with cuffs worn thin, and taught young farmers arithmetic that no lender brochure ever printed. In 1987, when Brett had only 80 rented acres and no room for mistakes, she had once come in on a Thursday with fuel bills stacked and asked if she could float feed to Monday. Walter had opened the ledger, written her name in blue pencil, and said, "Friday is discipline day. Pay then, sleep Saturday." It was not generosity without boundaries. It was structure with dignity. She paid Friday, and he never had to ask again. From 1988 through 1998, she turned that rule into a complete operating framework. Harvest proceeds were split, the same day deposits cleared. 55% operating account, 20% tax and insurance reserve, 15% land fund, 10% machinery and emergency repairs. If corn closed below her planning price by more than 12% for 3 consecutive weeks, personal draw dropped first, never feed quality, never insurance, never taxes. In 1991, when she netted only $62,400 after a weak soybean year, she cut household spending by $3,100 and still paid every supplier within terms. In 1994, net reached $98,700. She raised reserve contributions rather than lifestyle. In 1997, she had enough to buy a newer pickup, looked at one listed $21,800, and bought a used transmission for her existing truck at $780 instead. By the time she purchased the 130 acres in 1999, that discipline had become muscle memory. She closed the seller note in 42 months because every winter, custom repair check went to principal. In 2001, principal reduction totaled $14,200. In 2002, $16,100. In 2003, final payoff, plus filing fees of $286. The day the lien release came, she put it in a plastic sleeve and wrote one line on the back: "Ownership is oxygen." She kept the sleeve in the same metal drawer as the ruled ledger and every paid Friday receipt Walter had ever initialed. Walter's stroke in 2014 closed more than a business chapter. It closed an era where a merchant knew who treated credit like a tool and who treated it like weather. At his retirement gathering that June, held in the machine shed behind the old store, because he could not stand long but wanted to see everyone, Brett arrived in the same Silverado and left an envelope with Kelsey for Walter's wife, June Harlan. Inside was a cashier's check for $18,000 marked Tab Reserve Scholarship, with a simple note: "Use this for any local producer under 30 who agrees to weekly settlement and monthly bookkeeping review for 1 year." Quiet giving. No announcement from a podium. June accepted it with both hands, and tears she tried to hide in her shoulder. 3 days after that gathering, Brett opened 2 new accounts at First Wabash Community Bank. Not a credit line, only ring-fenced cash buckets. Account 1, feed float, initial deposit $30,000, replenished every Friday from operating receipts. Account 2, input shock, initial deposit $90,000, designated for fertilizer, diesel, and emergency protein supplementation. She asked the loan officer for no product. She asked only for same-day transfer capability and paper statements mailed monthly. The officer, Evan Lowry, had expected a financing conversation because Nolan had already told half the county she could not weather 2014 without leverage. Instead, he watched her move money into structure and sign no note at all. By mid-July 2014, 12 weeks of elevated feed costs had passed. Extra spend was exactly $22,320, matching her projection within $40 because she logged ration changes daily. She covered the entire increase from feed float and replenished half by August through staggered grain sales and custom baling invoices. Interest paid, 0. Late fees, 0. Revolving balance, 0. The branded 19.24% account would have charged roughly $2,147 in interest over the same period if those balances had rolled conventionally through fall. She wrote that comparison in red ink in her ledger margin and boxed it. This was the period when neighbors began separating into camps, not by character, but by balance sheet fragility. Brett saw it up close and never mocked any of it because she knew how thin the line could be when weather and policy arrived together. Dale Mercer, good operator and first one at every volunteer fire breakfast, consolidated machinery notes into one $412,000 package at 5.2%, believing fixed monthly structure would buy clarity. It bought time, then strain. Lena and Curtis Bell carried $268,000 in operating debt through a dry spell, expecting one stronger corn year to reset. Miguel Santos took a variable loan that looked reasonable at 4.1% until it did not. Hannah Price bridged feed purchases on cards because she was trying to protect payroll and keep family labor intact. None of them were reckless people. They were people asked to outrun math. By the first week of October 2014, Brett did what she had done for decades on Fridays before sunset, only now under new policy and with extra documentation. She loaded feed in smaller lots, paid at point of sale in cash or debit from pre-funded accounts, and archived every receipt by week number. Her truck looked poorer than ever, odometer at 294,600. Passenger door rusted through at the seam. Nolan's showroom inventory looked newer than ever, and his pitch did not change. He met her near the scale house one windy afternoon, handed her another glossy printout, and ran the same argument with updated urgency. Rates are still workable. You can leverage growth now and smooth the volatility. You need modern iron to stay competitive. Brett scanned the line items. New tractor payment projection, $1,146 monthly. Mixer and service add-on, $388. Operating line interest variable. Total fixed plus floating exposure, large enough to turn one bad quarter into cascading obligation. She folded the page once, returned it, and said the same words she had used in 2011. I pay as I go. Then she drove back toward her north field in a truck that looked like a warning to everyone who judged by paint, while her ledger in the seat beside her recorded something else entirely. Policy shock absorbed, weather shock absorbed, no revolving debt introduced, reserves intact, discipline still compounding one Friday at a time. That evening, she parked behind the machine shed, carried the receipt envelope into the farmhouse, and sat at the kitchen table with 3 columns open in her ledger: feed float draw, operating inflow, and reserve replacement schedule. She entered the final October figures by hand, checked each subtotal twice, and wrote one planning line for the next cycle. No policy controls cash rhythm if cash rhythm is pre-built. It was a dry sentence, but it governed the next 9 years. By the first Friday of January 2015, she had redesigned her weekly operating pattern around the new store rules without changing her core rule. Monday purchases were capped at 28% of expected 7-day hog ration demand. Wednesday purchases were capped at 34%. Friday purchases closed the week only after weight checks. That split reduced overbuy risk when weather shifted and kept cash movement aligned with real inventory use. Her total feed spend for 2015 reached $356,840, down from her stressed 2014 run rate, even though per-ton pricing remained elevated in the first quarter. Gross farm revenue closed at $699,500. Operating expense, including feed, seed, fertilizer, diesel, veterinary costs, and hired seasonal labor, closed at $602,380. Net before tax came to $97,120, exactly the figure she had projected in a conservative scenario at planting. She transferred $41,000 to land reserve, $22,000 to machinery reserve, and $18,000 to treasury bills laddered at staggered maturities from 6 to 24 months. She spent $8,400 cash on the used 1978 International Harvester 108-6 and logged $1,120 for the injection pump rebuild already planned, then compared it against the $94,000 financed alternative Nolan had pitched. Her 5-year projected ownership cost on the rebuilt tractor remained under $21,000. The finance package still projected above $134,000 before service add-ons. The gap remained 6 figures. 3 seasons later, the arithmetic had matured from defensive posture into deliberate accumulation. In 2016, gross revenue was $731,200, expense $620,760, net $110,440. In June of that year, she purchased 80 acres adjoining her west boundary for $296,000 cash. Closing costs included no lien filing. She funded it with $188,000 from land reserve, $72,000 from maturing treasuries, and $36,000 from retained earnings in the first 2 quarters. Her owned acreage rose, her rental dependency dropped, and her annual rent exposure declined by $15,360. In 2017, drought pressure returned and net income softened to $91,870. She did not sell land, did not draw on revolving credit, and did not skip any supplier payment terms. Household spending was held near $31,740 again, with food at $6,480, clothing at $540, utilities at $2,220, and no installment debt added. In 2018, better yields and disciplined input timing moved net to $129,600. She allocated $52,000 to the land fund, $27,000 to liquidity, and $20,000 to short-term government paper, yielding between 2.1 and 2.8%. Her Silverado crossed 307,000 miles that autumn, rust spreading along the passenger door seam, and people still read it as evidence of strain rather than choice. Before we go any further, if you want to see exactly how this ledger turns into a public moment, Nolan Cannot Explain Away, subscribe now and stay with the numbers, because the next phase is where appearance and reality separate in plain view. By the second week of May 2019, she had one neighboring parcel under contract and 3 backup parcels she was prepared to walk away from if terms changed by even 1%. She closed on 120 acres for $468,000 cash, funded through a combination of retained earnings and treasury redemptions she had laddered for that purpose in 2017 and 2018. Net income for 2019 finished at $142,300 after closing costs and drainage repairs. Her owned acreage climbed again while her rent volatility fell again. In 2020, when supply chain delays raised repair lead times and input ordering became less predictable, she maintained the same Friday settlement discipline and closed the year at $118,500 net. She added no consumer debt, no machinery note, and no revolving line. In 2021, stronger commodity pricing and tight cost control pushed net to $156,700. Instead of scaling fixed commitments, she built optionality, $64,000 into liquid reserve, $45,000 into land fund, and $31,000 into staggered treasury maturities. Her recorded liquid position entering 2022 gave her flexibility that looked passive to outsiders but acted like insurance in motion. The contrast with her peers sharpened in those same years, and this is where the story needs care because none of these people were careless. Dale Mercer had operated with skill for decades and carried a reputation for helping neighbors at harvest without keeping score. In 2018, he consolidated multiple equipment notes into one $412,000 package at 5.2%, trying to simplify payments and preserve working capital. The structure looked manageable at origination. Projected annual debt service around $55,000, assumed hog margins stable, assumed rented acreage retained. Then margins compressed, repair costs rose, and 2 landlords shifted terms upward in the same cycle. By late 2021, his fixed obligations consumed cash that would have covered operating shocks. He fought through one restructuring and sold non-core equipment. But the second year broke the schedule. He lost 640 rented acres at auction. The loss was not moral failure. It was sequence risk meeting fixed leverage. Lena and Curtis Bell faced a similar trap from a different direction. They carried $268,000 in operating debt into a drought year, expecting a partial recovery in corn and soy to close the gap after harvest. Rain timing failed twice, basis moved against them, and feed costs stayed high longer than underwriters modeled. They missed one restructuring window while waiting on projected yield revisions, then missed a second after collateral values were marked down. Bankruptcy followed. They did not stop working. They reduced scale, sold higher-cost units, and took temporary off-farm income, but debt structure had already taken command of their calendar. Miguel Santos signed a variable loan at 4.1% during a low-rate period, calculated his monthly obligations at the initial rate, and planned conservatively by his standards. When the reset moved the rate to 9.3%, the payment rose to $6,740 per month. He tried to hold the herd through one more cycle, but feed and fuel did not cooperate. He sold livestock to stop the bleed. Hannah Price used credit cards to bridge feed purchases while protecting payroll and family labor continuity. Her revolving balance peaked at $73,900. Even with disciplined personal spending, interest drag consumed working capital. She exited livestock entirely to preserve the farm base and avoid wider default. 3 days after New Year in 2022, fertilizer quotes posted at levels most operators had never modeled for a full season. Urea and blended nutrient costs that had been near $412 per ton rose toward $1,086 per ton, depending on delivery timing and composition. Diesel moved above $5 per gallon in local contracts. Cash rent held firm in many tracts because landlords watched commodity headlines, not input spreadsheets. Brett responded with smaller lot purchases, tighter application timing, and weekly reconciliation instead of monthly assumptions. Her 2022 net income dropped to $103,400, a meaningful contraction. Yet she paid every supplier inside terms and carried no revolving balance into 2023. She did not pretend the year was easy. She adjusted planting populations on lower-performing ground, negotiated early pay discounts where possible, and delayed non-critical upgrades. Survival was arithmetic and pacing. The broader county picture was harsher. Dale Mercer entered 2022 with less room than his reputation suggested and spent most of the year negotiating against math that moved faster than the crop cycles. Lena and Curtis Bell, already in bankruptcy proceedings, had to make decisions from a constrained menu: protect core acres, surrender marginal equipment, and rebuild trust with vendors one invoice at a time. Miguel Santos took custom work to stabilize household cash while rebuilding a smaller production plan. Hannah Price stepped away from livestock operations and moved toward procurement and logistics work, where her discipline with invoices and terms became an asset rather than a burden. None of them were mocked by Brett, and none were written off by her as cautionary tales. She understood too well how a decent plan can fail when input inflation, rate resets, and weather stack in the same window. By mid-September 2023, the pressure that had fractured leveraged balance sheets was still present, but Brett entered the season with a different structure. She had no monthly machinery note, no revolving consumer line, no variable debt that could reset against her, and enough liquid assets to absorb temporary margin compression without selling core assets at poor timing. Her net income that year reached $187,900. In November, she closed on a 160-acre parcel for $1,040,000. Funded through retained earnings and Treasury ladder redemptions she had staged across prior years. That purchase was not a gamble on prestige. It reduced future rent exposure, secured contiguous field efficiency, and locked in production control she could plan around regardless of lender sentiment. Her own land total reached 770 acres with no liens recorded. Nolan kept making his rounds through Vigo County, continuing to argue that she was undercapitalized because she refused leverage. He was consistent. And consistency matters even when the premise is wrong. He could point to shiny inventory, deferred payment windows, and projected efficiency curves. Brett could point to closed ledgers, paid receipts, and land records. In late 2023, he offered one final, bundled growth package to several producers still trying to stabilize after 2 punishing years. Some considered it because their alternatives were narrowing. Brett did not. She kept the same old Silverado in service, now past 320,000 miles, repaired a brake line for $186, replaced 2 belts for $74, and drove to Harlan Feed and Seed every Friday with the same discipline she had practiced under Walter Harlan decades earlier. By the first week of January 2024, county records were updated and searchable, and people who had spent years reading her patched overalls as a sign of weakness started seeing deed transfers, cash closings, and the absence of liens in black and white public documents. The receipts she had archived, the reserves she had ring-fenced, and the Fridays she had treated as non-negotiable were no longer private habits. They were measurable structure, visible to anyone willing to read past the truck. By noon that same Friday, 2 growers had already printed the parcel maps from the county website and brought them folded into quarters to the back table at Renshaw Diner. They were not gossiping for sport. They were trying to reconcile what they had assumed with what the recorder had posted. Deed book references for 2016, 2019, and 2023, all in Brett Thornton's name, all marked as cash consideration, all without lender attachments. One map showed the west boundary addition of 80 acres at $296,000. Another showed the 120-acre purchase at $468,000. The third, the one that made people quiet, showed 160 acres at $1,040,000, closed the previous November. 3 transactions, $1,804,000 total, no liens. Kelsey Ward saw the same documents that afternoon when a supplier representative asked whether Brett had finally enrolled in the revolving account after buying more acreage. Kelsey checked the customer profile and gave the same answer she had given for years. No credit card, no revolving balance, point-of-sale settlement, and pre-funded debit only. Then she added one fact she had never needed to say aloud before. Not one missed Friday payment under either ownership structure. The representative looked toward the parking lot, saw the Silverado with fresh rust around the wheel arches, and laughed once in disbelief, not mockery this time, more like someone discovering the scale was set in kilograms while everyone else had been arguing in pounds. By the 3rd week of March 2024, auction flyers started circulating for a full lot of used hay and feed equipment assembled from 2 estate dispersals and 1 downsizing operation. The package included a vertical mixer, 2 forage wagons, 3 gravity boxes, a feed conveyor, and support implements that would normally be split for higher aggregate bids. Brett asked for serials, maintenance logs, and appraisals, then spent 2 evenings checking each unit's remaining service life against local repair capacity. She was not buying for prestige, and she was not buying to flip. She was modeling what it would cost to keep 3 strained farms operating without locking them into new notes. At the spring auction in April, Nolan Pike stood near the clerk's table in a pressed jacket, greeting customers by first name, still working every angle he had worked for a decade. He noticed Brett when she stepped out of the old truck with a manila envelope and no bitter theatrics. Her overalls were clean and faded. The 2 patches at her left knee were still there. The crowd had changed, though. People had seen the deed records. They were watching her differently. Bidding on the full lot climbed quickly past $320,000, then slowed near $390,000 when transport and repair estimates started trimming optimism. Brett entered at $396,000, a liquidation investor countered. She moved to $402,750 and stopped. Silence held for several seconds. Then the auctioneer dropped the hammer. Sold. At settlement, she opened the envelope and placed a cashier's check on the table for $402,750 issued by First Wabash Community Bank that morning. Nolan asked to inspect it, then asked the clerk to hold the paperwork while he called the issuing branch. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Half the building leaned closer. He gave the check number, routing details, and payee. The bank officer verified authenticity and immediately available funds. Then, after the clerk confirmed Brett's same-day written and verbal authorization on file for this transaction, the officer answered Nolan's second question and confirmed that Brett's liquidity and Treasury ladder coverage exceeded the amount several times over as of the prior business day. The room changed temperature without anyone touching a thermostat. The number that spread through Vigo County by supper was not a rumor. It came from her accountant's signed balance sheet dated March 31st, 2024, later filed in restructuring disclosures. Net worth $7,912,400 with no revolving consumer debt and no machinery liens. Land equity carried the largest share. Liquid reserve and Treasury maturities provided the operating shock absorber. The woman with the nylon tailgate strap was not scraping by. She was capitalized. In notes later attached to the hearing file, the contrast was framed in plain terms. The county had to decide whether to trust appearances or audited cash flow under stress. 3 months later, that question became operational in a courtroom. On July 18th, 2024, the county restructuring hearing opened with 3 farms facing liquidation pathways that would have stripped equipment value and reduced long-term production capacity for everyone connected to them. Dale Mercer's package still carried residual obligations after auction losses. Lena and Curtis Bell were inside bankruptcy constraints with limited refinancing options. Miguel Santos had stabilized household cash through custom work, but could not rebuild herd scale on commercial terms. Hannah Price, now out of livestock, had strong procurement discipline, but no affordable bridge to re-enter cooperative ownership. Creditors had one investor proposal on file: rapid liquidation of distressed machinery, higher rate refinancing on remaining assets, and aggressive collateral triggers. Brett filed a competing plan 48 hours before the hearing. It was not sentimental, and it was not vague. She committed $1,260,000 in zero-interest bridge notes across 7 years, funded by present cash and maturing treasuries already identified by QSIP in the filing appendix. First payment deferred 12 months. Security structure tied to production covenants. Inventory reporting and mandatory monthly bookkeeping classes facilitated by a neutral accountant. She would purchase designated distressed machinery at independent appraisal value, then lease it back at maintenance cost only, eliminating markup and financing spread. The projected fixed payment reduction across the recipient farms was $18,430 per month versus the best commercial refinancing quotes submitted to the court. Nolan requested permission to address competitiveness implications. He argued that leverage growth remained the only path to scale efficiency and warned that concessionary terms could delay modernization. The judge asked one question: was his alternative fully funded today? It was contingent on approvals and staged disbursement. Brett's was wired and documented. Creditors shifted toward certainty. Evan Lowry testified to funds verification. 2 appraisers testified to machinery valuations. The neutral accountant, Priya Mendel, testified to enforcement design for monthly classes and ledger compliance. By late afternoon, the court approved Brett's structure with minor reporting adjustments. No applause, no speeches, just signatures and stamped orders. Implementation began the next Monday, and this is where her philosophy moved from private protection to public utility. Dale received a $420,000 zero-interest bridge segment tied to a 7-year schedule and a lease-to-own pathway on recovered equipment at maintenance basis. His required outflow dropped from a projected $11,260 monthly under commercial offers to $4,980 during year 1, then stepped modestly after 2 profitable quarters. Lena and Curtis were assigned $360,000 with strict inventory, turnover reporting, and input purchase caps tied to yield history instead of optimistic projections. Their monthly fixed pressure fell by $4,870. Miguel received $280,000 with herd rebuild gates at 40 head, 80 head, then 140 head only after margin thresholds were met. Hannah did not take livestock debt at all. She received a $200,000 operating and systems tranche to run feed procurement for the cooperative unit formed around the auction equipment, with board oversight and weekly payable discipline. The implementation memo emphasized the same lesson. Structure mattered, because generosity without enforcement could fail as quickly as bad credit. Brett's plan was generous in cost and strict in design. Every recipient attended bookkeeping class on the first Tuesday of each month. Attendance was not symbolic. Priya reviewed bank statements, feed conversion ratios, fuel logs, and payable aging line by line. Missed 2 classes without documented cause and lease concessions paused. Break covenant thresholds twice and discretionary purchases froze. The terms protected dignity by protecting solvency. By November 2024, early indicators were measurable. Dale posted positive operating cash flow for 3 consecutive months and rebuilt trust with 2 landlords who had moved him to annual review status. Lena and Curtis reduced overdue vendor balances from $47,300 to $11,900 and held their 180-acre core without forced sales. Miguel cleared the first herd gate and secured forward feed contracts at lower volatility bands through the cooperative. Hannah cut procurement slippage from 3.8% to 1.1% and negotiated timing discounts that saved member farms $38,640 across 1 winter ordering cycle. None of these numbers made anyone rich overnight. They moved families from triage to control. The deeper examination was completed at year-end in a 30-page financial memorandum prepared for creditors, participants, and county extension staff. It tracked Brett's accumulation model and the rescue model in parallel, so no one had to rely on myth. Her annual net sequence was listed exactly. 2014, $84,300. 2015, $97,120. 2016, $110,440 with first land purchase. 2017, $91,870 during drought pressure. 2018, $129,600. 2019, $142,300 with second land purchase. 2020, $118,500. 2021, $156,700. 2022, $103,400 during input shock. 2023, $187,900 with third land purchase. 2024, Operating net moderated by rescue deployment, while liquid reserve remained $612,000 after committed transfers, because maturities had been laddered in advance. The memo also showed the counterfactual that Nolan had been selling for years. If Brett had taken the 2011-era $94,000 equipment note at 6.9% for 12 years, then layered the 2014 bundled package with variable exposure, her modeled fixed obligations and interest drag would have reduced cumulative deployable cash by more than $780,000 by mid-2024, depending on reset assumptions. Under stress years, that reduction would have limited land acquisition timing and likely blocked the $1,260,000 rescue commitment entirely. Debt was not merely a cost in that model, it was opportunity for closure. Recipient trajectories were mapped with the same clarity. Under commercial refinancing terms filed in July, combined annual fixed payments for the 3 distressed farms would have been $463,560. Under Brett's zero-interest bridge with maintenance cost leaseback, combined year-one fixed obligations were $242,400, a reduction of $221,160. Monthly delta, $18,430, consistent with hearing exhibits. That delta was redirected to feed quality, deferred repairs, tax compliance, and reserve rebuilding. By design, money stayed in production rather than servicing spread. The cooperative arithmetic added a multiplier layer. Equipment purchased at auction for $402,750 replaced an estimated $1,180,000 in financed new equipment equivalents. Even after allocating $96,000 over 2 years for repairs and shared transport, members avoided roughly $681,000 in projected interest and fee burden over comparable note horizons. Hannah's procurement management lowered per-ton feed cost variance enough to improve planning accuracy, which reduced panic buying, which reduced expensive short-notice freight. Small percentages became large outcomes when repeated weekly. By the last Friday of December 2024, Brett settled her feed purchase before sunset, as she always had, filed the receipt by week number, and drove home in the same Silverado, odometer now above 326,000 miles. The tailgate strap had been replaced once, not upgraded, just replaced. At her kitchen table that night, she updated one final line for the year in the same careful handwriting that had carried her through policy shocks and weather shocks and public judgment. Liquidity is quiet until someone needs it. On the first Tuesday of January 2025, Priya Mendel opened the bookkeeping class at 7 o'clock in the extension office basement with a stack of ledgers, 3 calculators, and one rule written on the board in black marker: cash flow before pride. Dale Mercer sat in the front row with his cap in both hands. Lena and Curtis Bell sat together, each with separate notebooks, because Priya had insisted they track line items independently before reconciling. Miguel Santos arrived 10 minutes early with feed invoices clipped by month. Hannah Price came in carrying cooperative purchase orders and a binder tabbed by supplier, freight, and delivery variants. Brett took the back chair near the wall heater and said very little. She was not there to supervise personalities. She was there to enforce structure she had funded with $1,260,000 and promised to keep transparent. Priya worked through January numbers line by line. Dale had reduced machinery idle cost by consolidating field passes, saving $1,140 that month. Lena and Curtis cut emergency input buys by pre-scheduling deliveries, trimming avoidable freight by $870. Miguel held herd expansion at the first gate, and posted a feed conversion ratio within covenant. Hannah renegotiated 2 protein contracts with early pay terms that lowered cooperative expense by 1.9% for the quarter. No one called those wins dramatic. They were durable. By March 2025, 3 months of compliance data gave the court monitor enough evidence to remove provisional warnings from all 4 recipient files. Dale's monthly obligation under Brett's structure remained $4,980 against a prior commercial projection above $11,000. Lena and Curtis were carrying their reduced fixed load without new arrears and had lowered payable aging above 60 days from $11,900 to $3,200. Miguel crossed the 80-head gate only after posting positive operating margin for 2 straight months, exactly as the covenant required. Hannah's cooperative procurement desk cut winter feed price volatility from a 14.2% swing band to 5.6% through timing discipline and pooled ordering. 1 season later, the effect started compounding beyond the original rescue group. In June 2025, the cooperative reported that shared use of the auction equipment had replaced 1,480 machine hours that members would otherwise have sourced through higher-cost custom rates or finance purchases. Maintenance and transport costs for the first 12 months totaled $44,380 below the $48,000 budget. Avoided financing burden stayed near projection. Cash preserved stayed in production. Let me stop here and ask you something. When pressure hits your own work, do you buy relief on terms you cannot control, or do you build a system that can survive bad timing? That question followed every person in that room, and their answers were visible in monthly statements, not speeches. By the second week of October 2025, Dale Mercer posted his first full profitable production year since the auction losses. Net operating surplus for his restored schedule came in at $68,240 after lease-to-own payments, tax accrual, and deferred repairs. 2 landlords who had pulled back acreage gave him 120 acres back under stricter but fair terms. He did not celebrate in public. He repaired drainage tile on a Saturday and mailed Priya his receipts on Monday. Lena and Curtis Bell closed 2025 with a smaller but stable 180-acre operation, exactly the scale their cash cycle could support. They had exited bankruptcy by then, completed all reporting requirements, and rebuilt supplier trust through on-time settlement. Their year-end books showed modest profit, $34,110, but the more important figure was 0 missed covenant months. They kept their core ground and their routine. Miguel Santos moved through the final herd gate in stages and reached 140 head without missing a payment. His monthly fixed obligation stayed within plan because expansion never outran margin. By spring 2026, he was profitable on operations and had resumed 1 local youth livestock mentorship evening each month, unpaid, because someone had done that for him years earlier. He said very little about rescue money. He talked about inventory discipline. Hannah Price never returned to personal revolving feed debt. She did not need to. She built the cooperative procurement desk into a precision operation with weekly payable rhythm modeled after Brett's old Friday rule. In 2026, she became debt-free except for a fixed-rate home mortgage and negotiated annual supply agreements that cut member emergency buys by almost half. The cooperative board renewed her contract at a higher salary and tied bonuses to verified savings delivered to member farms, not volume purchased. If you are learning something from this, pass it to someone who still thinks cash discipline is old-fashioned. The arithmetic does not age. The multiplier effect became explicit in the 2026 County Extension Review, which PREA prepared with Evan Lowry and an independent auditor. Brett's direct bridge notes and leaseback design had stabilized 4 primary recipients, but the secondary impact touched 12 farms through equipment access, feed procurement, and shared logistics. Combined controlled acreage across that network reached 2,980 acres by fall 2026. Delinquency rate on cooperative obligations was 0. Aggregate fixed payment burden, compared with 2024 commercial refinance scenarios, remained lower by $17,920 per month even after planned step-ups. Over 24 months, that difference kept $430,080 inside operating businesses instead of sending it to financing spread. Small monthly relief became strategic capacity. Nolan Pike's resolution came without spectacle and without erasing what he had argued for years. In February 2025, 6 months after the restructuring hearing, his dealership closed the high-interest in-house financing desk that had pushed bundled variable packages to smaller operators. The official reason was portfolio realignment and risk concentration. The practical reason was performance. Too many notes had been written against optimistic assumptions that failed under input shocks and rate resets. Nolan did not vanish from Vigo County. He shifted into used equipment consulting by late 2025, advising operators on service history, parts availability, and total cost of ownership rather than monthly payment optics. He still dressed clean, still arrived early, still knew machinery. What changed was his language. Younger sales staff later repeated one sentence he gave them in private training. If cash flow cannot survive a bad year, do not call it affordable. He never delivered that line from a stage, and he never attached Brett's name to it in public, but everyone understood where he learned it. In May 2026, Nolan met Brett near the cooperative yard while she was checking tire wear on a forage wagon. Her Silverado sat by the fence, odometer just over 330,000. Tailgate strap replaced again with the same kind of nylon. He asked if she needed anything sourced. She said, "Used gearbox for the conveyor, fair price." He nodded, wrote it down, and found one within a week. No apology speech, no theater. A professional adjustment, late but real. By fall 2026, the roll call that had once looked like a foreclosure docket read like a map of rebuilt footing. Brett Thornton's accountant filed an updated net worth statement at $8,470,000, supported by land values, audited liquidity, and operating assets, still with no revolving consumer balance and no machinery liens. Her visible life remained intentionally modest. Same farmhouse. Same patched workwear rotated and repaired. Same truck, now at 331,000 miles, rust deeper at the seams but mechanically sound. Same Friday settlement habit, except she expanded it in winter by prepaying quarterly feed allocations for neighbors under documented stress windows, then reconciling actual use without interest. That winter, she formalized what had already become practice. The Thornton Friday Fund was endowed with $2,400,000 and governed by a 3-person local board: Priya Mendel for compliance, Evan Lowry for banking controls, and Hannah Price for procurement oversight. The fund charter was precise: 12 annual zero-interest starter loans of $40,000 each for producers who completed bookkeeping benchmarks and carried no revolving consumer farm debt. 8 emergency feed grants of $12,500 each for verified short-term shocks, with mandatory follow-up planning sessions so grant money solved causes, not only symptoms. First cohort performance exceeded projections. By the end of 2026, those participants collectively controlled 2,980 acres, and late payment incidents remained zero. Kelsey Ward, who had once delivered corporate tab policy with procedural neutrality, stayed at Harlan Feed and Seed and adapted the store's local program inside corporate limits. She could not restore handwritten tabs, but she created a voluntary Friday settlement report that helped customers track weekly balances before interest periods triggered. Adoption grew because people trusted numbers they could see. June Harlan used Brett's 2014 scholarship check exactly as intended. Across 11 years, the Tab Reserve Scholarship supported 17 producers under 30 through one-year bookkeeping commitments. 12 completed with clean records. 5 needed extensions. None were shamed. Walter Harlan, slower after the stroke but still sharp on arithmetic, attended one class each spring when health allowed and repeated his old sentence to anyone who asked why the rules were strict. Interest does not care if it rains. Priya Mendel kept teaching First Tuesday classes with the same black marker and the same opening rule. Evan Lowry remained at First Wabash, where he became known for asking loan applicants to stress test one bad season before signing any variable terms. Dale Mercer, Lena and Curtis Bell, Miguel Santos, and Hannah Price all stayed in operation through 2026 under different scales than before, but with stronger books, clearer boundaries, and restored decision space. If you want more stories where quiet discipline beats loud leverage, subscribe now because this pattern repeats wherever people choose control over appearance. Then leave a comment with one number you track every week that keeps your own life stable. Share this with one person who looks broke from the outside but never misses a payment deadline. On the last Friday before Christmas 2026, Brett stood at the same counter at Harlan Feed and Seed, signed for a modest load, and paid before sunset. The receipt printed, she folded it once and placed it in the same envelope style she had used for years. Outside, the Silverado started on the second turn, idled rough for 3 seconds, then settled. Snow sat thin along the gravel edge. No one in line laughed at patched knees anymore. They had seen the deeds, the classes, the paid ledgers, the farm still running. In Vigo County, the clearest sign of wealth was still the least flashy one. A promise made on Monday, settled on Friday, repeated long enough to change other people's futures. She pulled the store door closed behind her, tucked the fresh receipt into the brown envelope on the passenger seat, and drove straight to First Wabash before the lobby lights dimmed for the holiday weekend. Evan Lowry was still at his desk with his tie loosened and a stack of year-end reconciliations open. Brett set 4 folders down without small talk. Winter prepay schedules for Dale Mercer, for the Bell operation, for Miguel Santos's Herdgate account, and for the cooperative account Hannah Price managed. The total pre-funded amount was $147,500, allocated in weekly release tranches, so no one could burn through it in one anxious order cycle. Evan checked each authorization, matched signatures to prior filings, and stamped all 4 with same-day execution. "Same rules as last winter?" he asked. "Same rules," Brett said. "Friday reconciliation. No exceptions." He nodded, then added the callback she had requested in writing after every major transfer since 2014. By 5:42 that evening, she had phone confirmations from each recipient line, each one logged on her yellow legal pad with time, amount, and initials. The external contacts were closed before supper. Dale answered from his shop and said only, "Received. Thank you. Books on Tuesday." Lena put the call on speaker so Curtis could hear the terms again. Miguel repeated the release schedule, back to her word for word. Hannah emailed confirmation of cooperative receipt at 551 with purchase windows attached and board countersignatures from Priya and Evan. Nothing informal. Everything documented. 4 days later, on the first Tuesday of January 2027, Priya Mendel began class with an audit board instead of a lecture. She pinned 12 index cards, one for each Thornton Friday Fund starter loan issued in 2026 at $40,000 zero interest, then 8 cards for emergency feed grants at $12,500. Under each card, she wrote 3 figures: gross margin, reserve ratio, and payable aging. Brett watched from the back row while Hannah handed out procurement variance sheets and Miguel passed coffee down the table to Dale without ceremony. The trajectories were no longer projections. Dale's lease-to-own schedule on 220 recovered acres showed 24 on-time payments, principal reduced by $61,400, and operating reserve rebuilt to $48,200. Lena and Curtis posted their second consecutive profitable year on the 180-acre footprint, netting $39,870 after tax accrual and equipment maintenance. Their bankruptcy file had been formally closed the previous month. Priya placed the stamped discharge copy in their binder and said, "This one stays on top where you can see it." Miguel's herd held at 140 by choice, not constraint, with positive cash flow in 5 consecutive quarters, and no covenant misses. Hannah's cooperative desk reported delinquency at 0 across all members and documented savings of $82,440 over 2 winter seasons from timing discipline alone. By the second week of February, the multiplier was visible in places that had not existed when the hearing opened in 2024. 2 starter loan recipients who had rented fragmented ground now pooled equipment access through the cooperative and signed a shared labor agreement that cut duplicate passes enough to save 312 diesel gallons in 1 month. A third recipient refinanced nothing, bought a used planter row unit package for $6,300 cash, and hit planting windows without emergency freight. Across the first cohort, controlled acreage stood at 3,140 by spring planting, up from 2,980, and still with 0 late payments. 1 discipline structure had become a local operating standard. Nolan Pike's final turn happened in daylight, in his own showroom, with no dramatic speech. On March 3, 2027, he called his sales team to the parts counter and handed out a 1-page policy revision that formalized for his used equipment consulting team and partner showroom referrals a standing ban on high-interest, in-house style packages and variable teaser structures for small operators. Commission formulas were rewritten around verified total cost of ownership and service life planning. He kept 1 frame sales award on the wall and took down 3 posters advertising easy monthly terms. A younger rep asked if this would cost them deals. Nolan answered with the arithmetic he once ignored. "It will cost us bad deals," he said. "Those are the expensive ones." He drove to Brett's place 2 weeks later in a used service truck, not the polished dealership pickup. He had sourced the conveyor gearbox she requested, with service records and 2 price options, and laid both quotes on her workbench. She looked at the sheets, picked the lower mileage unit at $1,180, and paid by check on the spot. "You were right about sequence risk," he said quietly. "Eyes on the bench vise. Not on her." Brett tightened the checkbook cover and gave him the line she gave everyone, stripped to function. "Math was right, not me." That was the resolution. He did not ask for absolution. He changed how he worked and trained others to stop selling fragility as progress. By late April, Brett opened the metal drawer in her farmhouse and performed the archive ritual she had repeated for years, this time with Priya present so the foundation records would be complete. She placed the Christmas 2026 receipt envelope beside every paid Friday receipt Walter Harlan had initialed, then added the bank verification copy from the 2024 auction check, the hearing order approving the $1,260,000 bridge plan, and the annual independent audit of the Thornton Friday Fund. She removed one item from active files, the glossy bundled finance brochure Nolan gave her in 2014. She did not destroy it. She moved it to a training folder Priya used in class under a tab labeled Counterfactual Cost. The plastic sleeve with her 2003 lien release stayed where it had always been, top right corner of the drawer. Physical evidence resolved, preserved, and teachable. In June Harlan arrived at the cooperative office with Walter in a wheelchair, his hands thinner, but his memory intact. Kelsey Ward had arranged the visit after finishing the store's quarterly Friday settlement report, which now had 63 participating accounts. Hannah met them at the door and showed them a wallboard tracking weekly balances before any interest period began. Walter read each column slowly, tapped the heading with one finger, and smiled. "Friday still matters," he said. He passed away peacefully in August 2027 with June and 2 nephews at his side. At his service, held in the same machine shed where his retirement gathering took place, Priya announced that the Tab Reserve Scholarship Brett funded in 2014 would continue under a new name, the Walter and June Harlan Discipline Grant. June approved the change with a nod and a steady voice. No loose thread remained around that original desk, that original rule, or the check Brett left in an envelope 13 years earlier. By Harvest 2027, every named life in the story had a current place and a measurable footing. Brett was still on the same farm, still running mixed grain and hogs across owned ground that remained lien-free, still driving the Silverado, now nearing 338,000 miles with rust deeper at the seams and a third nylon tailgate strap. Dale was still farming and had regained credibility with landlords through statements, not promises. Lena and Curtis were still together and still solvent at a scale their books could support. Miguel was still rebuilding cautiously and mentoring younger producers on inventory control. Hannah was still debt-free except her fixed mortgage and had become the county's most trusted feed procurement manager. Priya was still teaching First Tuesdays with hard rules and no shaming. Evan was still verifying funds, now known for rejecting fragile loan structures before they became public failures. Kelsey was still at Harlan Feed and Seed, still converting corporate policy into practical local tools. Nolan was still in equipment, but now in the used market, advising against notes that failed stress tests. June was still in Vigo County, chairing the renamed grant committee each spring. On the last Friday of that harvest season, Brett stood again at the feed counter before sunset, while a younger producer behind her asked Kelsey for the Friday report form instead of the revolving account brochure. Brett paid in full, folded the receipt once, and stepped into the cooling light. The old truck turned over on the second try, idled rough, then steadied. Gravel shifted under worn tires as she eased onto the county road. From the outside, it still looked like a modest woman in a tired pickup heading back to work. From the ledger, from the deeds, from the rebuilt farms, and the zero delinquency reports, it was the same thesis proven one more time. Appearance talks first, arithmetic speaks last.